So, Mr. Funchess, once again, I wanted to thank you for allowing me to come in today. And if we want to go ahead and get started with the interview today.
All right.
If you could just please tell me a little bit about growing up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. What was that like for you?
Well, it was quite an experience. I guess I grew up at the tail end of the Great Depression, so we lived on a farm, and of course we were poor. The little town in Orangeburg County was named Roseville. Most people have never heard of Roseville, but it's a very small town. And we lived about 4 miles from Roseville, so I was way out in the country. And I worked on the farm, and when I got home from school, my daddy always asked me, "Do you have any homework?" And if I said yes, he would tell me to, to do the homework, and then he had some work on the farm for me to do. And I enjoyed working on the farm, and I went to high school in Orangeburg High School, and I was more or less preparing myself to go to Clemson because I wanted very badly to go to college at Clemson, and so I took some agricultural courses in high school, more or less preparing myself for college at Clemson. But it was a great experience growing up on a farm in Orangeburg County.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. So what was, you said you wanted to go to Clemson College. Did you have any anticipation of being in the ROTC program at Clemson?
Yes. The big reason I wanted to go to Clemson was because my dad went there for 1 year. He took the 1-year agricultural course, which was available back during the time of World War II. But when I got to Clemson, it was 1944, and we were still heavily involved in World War II. And I knew there would be an ROTC program at Clemson, which suited me fine. And I might mention that when I got to Clemson, it was on a Monday morning after I had graduated the previous Friday night. I started to Clemson immediately because I was afraid that I would be drafted to go into the Army, but since World War II was still raging. And I got into the ROTC program. We had to wear uniforms. They could not get the cadet gray during the war because items such as the fabric were very scarce, so we wore the regular Army uniform. And I wore that Army uniform for the first 3 years. Then by the time I got to be a senior, the World War II had ended, and we were able to go back into the cadet gray. But the ROTC program back then was quite an experience. We had to get up in the morning around 6. We had to march to the dining hall, which we called back then the mess hall, and we had to get information. They would call the roll, then we would march to the mess hall, and we did that for all 3 meals. Then, since it was military college, we had to be accountable at all times. At 8:30 at night, we had what we call long roll, and it was always held on the floor of one of the barracks, in each barracks. And they called the roll to make sure everybody was present and accounted for. Then we went into our rooms and studied, and then at 11 o'clock, you could hear that bugle blowing taps. And that meant turn those lights off and go to bed.
Did you ever, at your time at Clemson, I know you said when World War II was going on, you were a freshman through a junior. Did you ever have any idea that you may be going into combat one day in the ROTC program?
Really, I did not, because I thought that when World War II ended, that would finalize all wars for quite some time. Now, before I graduated, I was called to Fort Jackson for pre-induction. But when I got there and had my physical and exam and so forth, they said, "Well, you're in advanced ROTC. we're going to send you back to Clemson. We are not going to induct you now, but we'll get you, or we'll call you as soon as you graduate. And that is, of course, is exactly what happened.
What was it like seeing some of your friends back at Clemson getting in pre-induction? What was it like seeing them go and you staying, knowing that eventually
Yes.
you have to go?
You know, it was quite an experience. The 4 years I was there, 30 or 40 different roommates. Now the reason for that, I'd have a roommate and 6 weeks later, he'd get his orders for pre-induction to go into the Army. And he would leave and someone else to come in, but every day someone in the Cadet Corps was receiving orders to report for pre-induction. And of course, I never saw them again until the end of the war, or maybe even years later. But it was a tremendously large turnover while I was in college, due to the fact that everyone had their education interrupted by military service.
What was it like for you when the Korean conflict broke out? What did you, I know you said you had gotten drafted, went back to Clemson and finished and became an officer. What was it like telling your parents that you had, officially joined service at this point?
All right. I graduated from Clemson and I started farming with my dad, but that did not last but just 2 or 3 months until I got my orders to report to Fort Jackson. And I was at Fort Jackson for about 1.5 years, and I was training recruits. And we had recruits to come in either on an 8-week training cycle or a 13-week training cycle. Then part of 1950, they decided that the possibility that Fort Jackson might be deactivated since World War II had ended, and so they shipped out most of us either to the European area or the Far Eastern Command. And I was assigned to the Far East, and they put me on a ship, of course, and took me to Yokohama, Japan. And at that time, I received orders to report to Kyushu Island on a city named Beppu, on the southernmost island, and that was in the 24th Infantry Division. There was another division located farther north, but I was very glad not to get into that division because it was quite cold up there. And I was quite pleased to be assigned to the 24th Division in the southern part of southern part of Japan. Of course, being in that southern part of Japan, we were the first ones that had to pack up whenever we heard about the Korean War.
How was it adjusting, leaving South Carolina and going to a faraway country in Japan?
Well, it was quite an adjustment because I had just gotten married and my wife was teaching, and we didn't know what to do, so we decided that if possible she would come and join me in Japan, and it was permissible at that time. So we went as far as to have our automobile shipped to Japan. And it finally arrived some 2 or 3 months later. Unfortunately, there was only one paved road near Beppu, and that was 6 miles long, to another little city named Oita. So after I got the car, there's no place really to go in the car, but my wife was still awaiting permission to join me in Japan. And then the very last part of June 1950, we heard that North Korea had invaded South Korea. And then I realized that I'd probably be going to Korea, so we stopped the plans for my wife to join me in Japan. But it was very traumatic Expected my wife to join me, and then realized that I had to go to war and she could not come to Japan and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So what was it like first coming into Korea, getting in your formations, making that trip from Japan over to Korea, knowing that you were entering a hostile area?
Well, we heard that the North had invaded South Korea, and that went on for several days. And very early in July, I was on maneuvers in the Yokosuka area, and they discontinued maneuvers abruptly and put us on trains and sent us back to Kyushu Island, where our headquarters were, and told us that we would be sent to Japan. We would be sent to Korea. We were in the 24th Infantry Division. They were flying over 1 or 2 battalions under command of Colonel Smith, and that's often been referred to as Task Force Smith. Almost simultaneously with that, they brought in 3 or 4 LSTs. They were World War II surplus, rusty LSTs manned by Japanese civilians. And they came from Yokohama to about 6 miles, to Oita, about 6 miles of where I was headquartered. And on the morning of July 4th, 1950, we had to go to Oita and board the LSTs. Well, I was in for quite a shock. I didn't see any U.S. military sailors. The LSTs were manned by Japanese civilians. And that just gives you an idea of how rapidly we were deployed. They did not wait for the Navy to be able to help us. They recruited these Japanese civilians, and they sent us over. It didn't take but about 24 hours. And the next day, July 5th, 1950, we got off the LSTs at the seaport at Incheon, South Korea.
Now, were you one of the first people, U.S. soldiers, to step foot in Korea, one of the first regular infantry?
Yes. Well, Task Force Smith, they flew over. So they beat us there about 2 days. But my unit was the next, and we were all in the same division. But other than Task Force Smith, my group was the very first.
Yeah. What was that like, going from, it seems, just a few years before, being in peacetime, training, planning on having your wife, Sybil, coming to Japan, and now you're in Korea, in what looks like it's going to be a full-scale conflict? Did you feel unprepared at all, or were you confident about what you could do?
I felt very unprepared, and the soldiers in Japan had other things on their mind rather than training for combat. And because of that, I did not feel too comfortable. However, at the same time, I, as well as everyone else, underestimated the abilities of the North Korean Army. We did not realize that North Korea had such a large army. We did not realize they were so well equipped by the Soviet Union and so well trained by the Soviet Union. We really thought that the thing would be over with in 30 days or 60 days, but once we made contact with the North Korean soldiers, then we immediately realized that we were in it for the long haul.
And I know you said in your book, in one of your first combat scenarios, you were in your battle formations and you had an A company and a B company, but you didn't even have a C company bringing up the rear. What was, in your first combat scenario, what was that like, not even having...
Well, we were under strength. rather than having 3 battalions, which is normal in the division, or 3 regiments, we only had 2 regiments. Then the regiments had only 2 battalions rather than 3 battalions. The squads, rather than having 4 infantry squads in a platoon, only had 3 squads.
Yeah.
So everything was downsized. And not only that, the equipment and the weapons that we used were left over from World War II. They were almost obsolete to start with. A lot of them were beginning to rust and did not function properly. And I also recall in Korea, I finally got some hand grenades, and they brought to us a case of hand grenades, which was 25 grenades. And we used the 25 grenades, and I believe out of the 25, probably 18 or 20 were duds and did not explode. And of course, that was a tragedy when you were throwing a hand grenade to protect yourself, and the grenade was corroded and rusted and did not explode. So the equipment was very inferior, worn out, inadequate, and in short supply.
Can you tell me a little bit about the first day you made contact with the North Korean?
Well, they moved us from Incheon northward, and we went through the city of Daegu. Then and Daegu now is where the Naktom perimeter finally ended up. But we advanced north of Daegu to a North Korean city known as Daejeon, and my company was moved north of Daejeon about 9 or 10 miles, and we got on the south bank of the Kom River, and we set up defensive positions on the Kom River and just sat there and waited to be hit by the North Korean army.
Now, you said when you were sitting there, you could actually see the Russian T-34 tanks that the North Koreans were using pull up on the other side of the bank and start firing at your men.
We were there for several days, and at night, the first night I heard a rumbling, and I didn't know what it was. It was across the river, but 13 Russian T-34 tanks came, and they turned and got directly across the river from me. The river was probably 150, maybe 200 yards wide. Now, I was dug in foxholes in the bank, or the dike, to prevent floods from the waters of the Kom River. And our foxholes were in that dike. But all night long, those 13 Russian tanks, they would fire at us. They did not do a lot of damage, but it was real scary to be across there with 13 Russian tanks. We did have 4 U.S. Army tanks, but they didn't come in until several days later.
Mm-hmm. And you said that one of those tanks would eventually save your life in combat one day.
Yes.
Can you tell me the story about that?
All right. On July 16th, after we'd been there several days, the North Korean army broke through. And they actually, my position held. I held them. And my platoon, it was only 50 of us in about a half-mile sector. But we held. But the sector to our right, which was under command of another company, they broke through there and they got behind us. And I was still fighting, and then a lieutenant that I knew in Japan came rushing up to me, says, Bill, you got to get out of here. They said the North Koreans have broken through, everybody has withdrawn. and you're sitting out here on this river by yourself. He says, go that direction. I think you can get out. Anyway, I assembled my men, and we crossed the rice paddies, and we walked through about at least a half mile of rice paddies, and got to a dirt road, and we sat down and rested for a few minutes because it was very tiring wading through those rice paddies, which had about 12 inches of water in them, and of course the soil beneath the water was boggy. It was hard walking. But we sat down and rested for about 5 or 10 minutes, not realizing that the North Koreans had already gotten behind us and had already gotten dug in the mountains overlooking the location where we were dug in. But after no more than 10 minutes, they opened fire on us. Thank goodness they gave us 10 minutes to rest. And they opened fire, and then they started coming down the mountain, and I could see them from time to time coming across one of my wounded men and bayoneting the men. But we did have 4 American tanks in the nearby area, and 2 of them had already gotten out. Then I heard a rumbling, and I stayed down low because I thought it was those Russian T-34 tanks that had gotten across the river. But then as he got right beside me, I saw the white star, and I realized it was a U.S. Army tank. But anyway, nothing I could do about it. And about 5 minutes later, I heard that rumbling again, and this time I peeped, and I saw the white star. And I knew it was our tank coming down that road. It was the last tank left. And so I waited till it got about 10 or 15 feet from where I was, and I was laying in a little ditch on the side of this dirt road. And when the tank got about 10 or 15 feet away, I jumped up with my M1 rifle in one hand, and I was waving to them. I stood right in the middle of the road, and to get them to stop. And I was yelling. Of course, they could not hear a word that I was saying. And they swung. I could see them swing that machine gun toward me, and I was maybe a little bit on the edge of the road, and they spun that tank in my direction, trying to run over me. Well, there was no place for me to go, so I jumped up on the track. And when I jumped up on the track, I was trying to get on top of the tank, and I lost my rifle, but I was able to get on top of the tank, and I kept yelling, open up, let me in. And then I heard somebody inside the tank yell out to his crew members, I suppose, "That ain't no gook, that's a GI, let him in." And the hatch flew open, and somebody stuck their head out and says, "Jump in here." And so I got into the hatch, and the hatch closed. Then they saw that I was an officer, and the tank commander says, "Lieutenant, stay down. We're going to keep on going and as far as we can. We think we can get out of here." Well, if we hadn't gone over a quarter of a mile, the tank stopped, and he said, "Lieutenant, there's a roadblock ahead. Must be 20 or 30 U.S. Army trucks and vehicles on fire. They apparently captured these vehicles and set them on fire, creating a roadblock." They said, we can't go through the roadblock. We're going to have to abandon the tank and try to get across country." And I said to the tank commander, who's a sergeant, I said, "Sergeant," I said, "I am exhausted." I said, "I don't believe I'm physically able to make a run for it through these mountains." I said, "Could you fire all your ammunition into that roadblock, and let's see if we can bust it up and break through?" He said, "Okay, we'll do that." He says, "Now, you're an extra man in this tank. There's no place for you." He says, "The only place you can possibly stay is on the floor which is above the engine. He said, that floor is hot. He says, but you'll be underneath the this gun. It was a 75 millimeter gun, relatively small as compared to what they use now. He says, we'll fire into it with this gun, but the breech flies back, and if you raise your head, it'll knock your head off. He said, now furthermore, those hot shells are going to fly out. They're going to fall on top of your shoulders. We said, we'll flip them off just as soon as they hit your shoulders. And so I said, I'm ready. Let's do it. And so I crouched down as low as I could, and that 75 millimeter gun opened fire, and it was a deafening sound because I wasn't but 6 or 8 inches from it, just below it. And I tried to keep my ears, cover my ears or keep that noise out. But that took place for 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. It must have been 20 or 30 of those shells dropped on my back, but they always knocked them off before I really got burned. And just a minute, the tank commander says, Lieutenant, we're out of ammunition. Says, we're going to try to bust through the roadblock like you wanted us to. He said, now, if we get hit, we're going to stop the tank, and we're going to get out, and you get out with us. And then we'll try to make it cross country. I said, okay, I'm ready. So he revved up the tank, and I could feel it as he hit the vehicles. I could feel a bump, 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 bump. But we kept on going, and the tank busted through the roadblock. And then we continued southward for another half mile, and of course I could not see anything, but the sergeant was telling me what was happening. He said, there's a group of Americans standing up on the side of the road. He said, we could stop and talk with them. I said, all right. And the tank stopped, and we all got out, and it was General William Dean, who was the commander-in-chief of all United Nations forces in Korea at that time. Mm-hmm. And General Dean asked me what the situation was, and I explained to him all that I knew. And in a few minutes he said, well, I'm going to send that tank back to the roadblock. I said, General, the tank is out of ammunition. I said, he has no ammo left. And he hesitated just a minute. He said, well, I want that tank to go back and give moral support to the GIs on the other side of that roadblock. I said, all right. And I told the tank commander that he had to go back. And he said, Lieutenant, you want to go with us? I said, well, I believe I'll walk on toward Daejeon. Mm-hmm. So I told him goodbye, and the tank moved north of back to the roadblock, and then I started walking toward Daejeon. General Dean remained in that area, but I understand that General Dean got back into Daejeon, and then several days later, General Dean got trapped in the city of Daejeon and could not withdraw southward, so he went cross country, and he was picked up and captured by the North Korean Army. Mm-hmm. And General Dean was a POW as of about July 20th, 1950. Mm-hmm. And he, of course, was the big prize for the North Korean Army.
Yeah, yeah. So now, after that first day of combat, and you realized, I'm in it now for the long run, what was it like, being pushed back, and eventually you came back? What was it like adjusting to combat life, now knowing that there's a real danger, seeing combat face to face, seeing that happen?
Well, I realized in a hurry that everything we had learned at Fort Benning, where I did my summer ROTC training, and everything that we had learned and everything I had taught recruits at Fort Jackson just didn't work in Korea. It was effective in World War II, because in World War II you had plenty of personnel on your side. You had personnel on your left, you had personnel on your right. But in Korea, we had to set up little roadblocks, and maybe 15 or 20 miles before you come across another roadblock. So we had to adjust to the situation in a hurry. And then we realized that once we got hit, it would be just a matter of hours before the enemy would circle and get around behind you. And then, once they got behind you in that mountainous terrain, your escape was almost impossible. And you could not count on reinforcements coming up to help you. And you did not have anybody on your left, and you had nobody on your right to come to your assistance. So we had to pretty well adapt to the situation, and it was entirely different from World War II and what I had learned at Fort Benning and what I had taught to recruits at Fort Jackson.
So can you take me through the process of coming back, and eventually setting up a defensive position, and eventually fighting the Koreans back up the mainland? What was that like?
Well, we would get hit, and once we got hit, we would withdraw to the next easily defensible location. It might be on a riverbank, or it may be at a tunnel in the highway, but we pick out some feature where we could set up a defensive position and we'd be more effective in slowing down the advance of the North Korean army. And we'd get hit, we'd withdraw, sometimes 5 or 10 miles, sometimes even a little bit more. And then we'd sit there, we'd get hit again, then we'd withdraw, and that was just repeated for weeks until we were pushed back all the way to the Naktong River, where the Pusan perimeter was eventually established. But the North Korean army almost pushed us all the way off of the peninsula of South Korea.
Can you tell me a little bit about your advance back through South Korea, claiming back the lands you had once walked through?
All right, I was in that Pusan perimeter, and we were holding just barely holding, and they were making breakthroughs in that Pusan perimeter. And then one day I heard a rumbling, and that rumbling continued, and then I could feel just the ground barely trembled. And I didn't know if it was an earthquake or what. I didn't really know what was happening. But I learned a few hours later that it was the Incheon invasion conducted by the Marine Corps primarily. And that was their artillery, and that was bombing the North Korean positions in the Incheon area very near the Han River. And after the Incheon invasion, the North Korean army almost disappeared. And we realized they were taking off their uniforms and putting on white peasant-type uniforms. But there was an immediate change in our situation after the Incheon invasion. The backbone of the North Korean army had pretty well been broken, and then we were able to advance northward with relatively little resistance at first.
So you said after the North Korean backbone had been broken, you were able to advance, and then I believe you said you made a discovery one day about some people who were coming into North Korea and helping out the Koreans. Can you tell me about the day that you first witnessed the Chinese become involved?
All right. It continued advancing in North Korea, I was in the 24th Infantry Division. The 24th Infantry Division was generally on the West Coast. Now, the U.S. Army is a good, well-equipped army, but in a mountainous country such as Korea, the U.S. Army was road-bound, and we had to stay on the roads, on the highways. Now, there weren't highways as we know. These were dirt roads, maybe 10, 12 feet wide. Really not enough, the roads were not wide enough by any means for one tank to meet or pass another. They were narrow roads, very crooked. But we continued northward. We passed through the North Korean, we passed through a city known as Anok, North Korea, where we heard gunfire as we approached the city on foot. And we learned that there had been a civil uprising in Anok. The non-communist faction had overthrown the communist rulers of the city of Anok. But we stayed in Anok only one night. We had met no resistance at all. We did not fire our weapons at all in Anok, even though the North Koreans were fighting among themselves in that city. We continued through Pyongyang, and at Pyongyang, that's where I got my first glimpse of Bob Hope, and he brought with him Marilyn Maxwell. Most people say it was Marilyn Monroe, but it was Marilyn Maxwell, another movie actress, and I did have opportunity to see Bob Hope's show, but we had our weapons with us, and we could hear firing no more than 2 or 3 miles away while we were watching this program presented by Bob Hope. We continued north of Pyongyang along the west coast, and we got to a city known as Anju, and I believe it's spelled A-N-J-U. We advanced north of Anju, and then we withdrew back to Anju and set up defensive positions on the banks of the Changchon River, because it's always easier, we thought, to hit the enemy as they cross that bridge. But the enemy did not always cooperate. They didn't come down that highway and cross that bridge. But we set up defensive positions near the bridge crossing the Changchon River. It was a battalion-sized roadblock, and that was 3 infantry companies. Each company had approximately 200 men. A company and B companies were nearest the river. C company, my company, was in reserve, and my company commander said to me, he said, "Bill, you've been in Korea longer than anyone else. We're going to put you in reserve, let you put your platoon all the way in the rear." And I said, "Don't do me any favors." I said, "because I'm afraid if they hit us, they may hit us from the rear." But anyway, they put me in the rear. And that first night, I was there in the rear, and everybody else was much nearer the banks of the river. I said, "I think I will send out a patrol to my left and a patrol to the right." And I did. And the patrol I sent to the left was under command of Sergeant Hartwell Champagne from Abbeville, Louisiana. And I says, "Sergeant, go out there, find your elevated location, and sit and look and listen." I said, "If you spot anything out of the ordinary, come back and tell me." And about daylight, or just shortly after daylight, Sergeant Champagne came rushing back to me. He said, "Lieutenant, the Chinese army is crossing the river." They said they're not using the bridge, they are getting to the banks of the river, they are undressing, they are holding their clothes in a bundle over their, in one hand, the weapon, in the other hand, they're wading across the river, and then getting on our side and redressing and moving toward the rear of our battalion area. And anyway, I got on the radio, and I couldn't find my company commander. I should have let him do this, but I couldn't find him. And I talked with battalion headquarters, but whoever I talked with, I wish I could remember the name. But they assured me that there were no Chinese troops in North Korea. And they said, what makes you so sure that they're Chinese? I said, well, I have 12 South Korean soldiers in my platoon. I said, the South Korean soldiers tell me they are not Korean. They're not either North Korean, they're not South Korean, they're definitely Chinese. And then the person in the battalion headquarters once again assured me that I was mistaken. And
you had another man with you who was able to help you up the mountain, and he said, Mr. Funchess, I'm not going to leave your side. I'm going to get you up this mountain. Can you tell me a little bit about him and what that experience was like?
Well, that was a West Point graduate, Lieutenant Mike Dow, D-O-W-E. I think he lives in Texas now, but he's a West Point graduate. And when the machine gun opened fire on us, I was hit in the foot. Lieutenant Mike Dow was not hit, and an enlisted man very close to me was not hit. And the two of them tried to help me up the side of that mountain. I looked around behind me, and all of my men had been killed or wounded. There was nobody left but the three of us. And I was holding on to the shoulders of Lieutenant Dow on my left and the soldier on my right. And so I handed my carbine to the soldier on my right, and I was holding on to both of them, and while I was holding on to them, the soldier got shot. And he rolled back down the mountain with his weapon and my carbine. And that left Lieutenant Mike Dow and me only with his weapon. But anyway, Mike says, Bill, I'm not going to leave you. He said, I'm going to stay with you. And I said, thank you, Mike. I said, that gives me a lot of peace and comfort, because I don't believe I can make it by myself. And I was holding on to him, and he was helping me walk and all of that. And I don't know if you want me to go beyond that point or not.
Well,
but anyway, while I was holding on to Mike Dow, a Chinese soldier popped up from nowhere. And he was no more than 20 or 30 steps away from us, and I saw his machine gun, his handheld machine gun. We called it burp gun because it fired so rapidly it sounded like a great big burp. And the Chinese soldier opened fire with his burp gun, and fortunately there was some little short-leaf pine and hemlock saplings in between us, and I could see bark flying. But the Chinese soldier did not hit us, and I could see the expression on his face. He looked dumbfounded that we hadn't fallen, and I grabbed the carbine from out of Lieutenant Dow's grasp, and I opened fire on the Chinese soldier. Well, we were able to walk for another 10 or 15 minutes until we came to a much larger group.
Mm-hmm. And you were captured. I guess going through, what was it like upon knowing you were now in the hands of a hostile nation? Was there any, what emotions were involved in that for you?
There's no way to explain it. It was humility, it was embarrassment, there was anger, it was hatred, it was extreme disappointment.
Were you scared at all?
Just a series of many, many emotions compounded into one. It was just absolutely unbelievable. And here were these Chinese soldiers, and I learned later they were the elite force in the Chinese army, and they were not young soldiers. They were, all of them looked to be 30 or 40 years old. And I learned later, they had been fighting General Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army for a number of years. They were well trained, they were good soldiers, but they were extremely angry at Lieutenant Mike Dow and me at the time of our capture. And they were hitting us and jabbing at us with these bayonets on the end of some of their rifles. And I am pretty sure we were probably been killed, but a Chinese officer ran up to the scene and he restored order, because I realized later, I believe one of their missions that day was to take prisoners. And I think that is the only reason we were not killed, because the Chinese army and I guess the Chinese government desperately wanted American prisoners.
Can you tell me what that officer said to you whenever he came up?
Well, I was being manhandled, but I was having to keep my hands above my head, because if I put my hands down to defend myself, I was sure I'd be killed. But the Chinese the Chinese officer ran up to me, and I suddenly realized he's dressed a little bit differently. His uniform was a little different, and he had on leather boots, fur-lined boots, I might add. And he was not too tall, but he reached up and he grabbed my arm. It was in the air, and he pulled my right arm down and started shaking my hand. Says, "We're not mad at you. We're mad at Wall Street." And I had no earthly idea what he meant, but it sure sounded better than "we're gonna kill you." But I kind of figured out later that he was telling me that he was not all that angry with the people of the United States, but he was angry at the government of the United States. But it was a very unusual type of conversation for a POW to have with his captor. And anyway, he turned around and I saw an English-Chinese dictionary in his back pocket. And while I was standing with my hands over my head, I said, "What nationality are you?" And after just a second, he said, "North Korean." I knew he was lying, because if he was North Korean, he would not have had an English-Chinese dictionary in his pocket.
So what was it like now being in captivity? Can you tell me a little bit about the journey you took from that day eventually to the POW camp, as they called it, that they took you to?
Well, after the Chinese officer restored order, apparently he instructed his soldiers to take me back to that machine gun that had fired and hit me in the foot. But as we approached the machine gun, I came across 4 of my soldiers who had been seriously wounded and who were on the ground. And the Chinese soldiers with me kicked them, yelled at them. I don't know what they were saying, but apparently get up. But my men were too badly wounded, they could not stand. And so they motioned for me to keep going, and I moved another 10 or 12 feet perhaps. I heard rifle fire, and I turned my head, and they had shot all 4 of my men in the back of the head. Then there's nothing I could do. They moved me to the machine gun and sat me down no more than 20 or 25 yards from that machine gun, and the machine gun was still firing at my men at different locations, and it was pretty terrifying to see the machine gun shooting my people. And all of a sudden I looked up, and it was a U.S., I guess, Army liaison plane overhead. And I said, I think I'm going to try to signal that plane if I can, but the soldiers were around that machine gun. I happen to still have my mess kit, and it was black on the outside because I'd been cooking in it, but it was shiny on the inside. So I was sitting on the ground, I crossed my legs, and I put that mess kit between my legs, opened it up with the shiny side exposed, and I kept moving it, trying to hit the sunlight to attract the attention of the liaison plane. Whether or not he spotted me, I don't know. But I was sitting there with a mess kit, flashing it in the sun, taking a great big chance of the Chinese soldiers seeing me. Well, they moved me then to a schoolhouse, and they kept bringing in other POWs all during the night. And somewhere around midnight or afterwards, I heard a vehicle coming down the dirt road, and I saw the headlights, and and the vehicle stopped. And in the vehicle was a Chinese doctor, and he left the headlights on, and they were bringing wounded Chinese soldiers, and I think some wounded North Korean soldiers, to the Jeep, and the doctor was working on them, bandaging them up in the headlights of the Jeep. Well, I was inside this old schoolhouse with other American POWs, and I was about the only one, I think, that was badly wounded, so I hobbled out toward that vehicle where that Chinese doctor was, and I got his attention, and I picked up my foot, and I showed it to him. And he yelled something at me and turned away. But I was persistent, and I kept standing there and raising my foot and pointing to my foot so he could see the blood flowing out. And finally, in disgust, he shouted something at me and pointed to a bloody bandage on the ground that he had taken off of a wounded Chinese soldier. I don't really know what he said, but I took it to mean, take that bloody bandage or leave it, because that's all you're going to get. So I picked up the bloody bandage and wrapped it around my foot because I knew I had to stop bleeding. And I might say right now, that was the only medical attention they ever provided me for my wounded foot. Well, maybe one exception. On one occasion, a woman came in with a red cross on her left upper arm, and she had a pair of tweezers and a bottle of mercurochrome. And I went to her and showed her my foot, and she took the tweezers and pulled out bone fragments that were extending through the flesh. Then she poured some mercurochrome on it. But going back to the march northward, we walked all that night, and daylight came, we were still walking. I was having a terrible time, and my men were trying to carry me, and they were stumbling and falling. But anyway, they were carrying me that first night. After daylight, sunrise, and shortly after sunrise, here come the U.S. Air Force jets. And they strafed that column of POWs, but fortunately they hit the Chinese and North Korean soldiers at the front of the column, and again they hit the Chinese and North Korean soldiers at the rear of the column. And as far as I know, they did not do any damage to the POWs. So apparently they knew that there had been some POWs. So that put an end to marching in the daytime, in the daylight hours. From that point on, we marched northward on these dirt roads and mountain trails and paths at night. Then we would hide all day long wherever daylight would happen to catch us. And the Chinese army was absolutely everywhere. And they would set up posts on top of the mountaintops. And from time to time, I could hear yell, "Hungo, Hungo," then quarter of a mile away, "Hungo, Hungo," and then half mile away, it would be repeated. And apparently that was their word for airplane. And when they shouted out "Hungo," I noticed all the Chinese soldiers would immediately hide or freeze. And that was their, I guess, their primitive air raid warning system. We walked for about 2.5 weeks. I was always the last man in the column. Some of the men who had been wounded, they were told they could fall out and they'd be put on the next truck northward. I advised them not to fall out if you can possibly walk, but they fell out anyway. And I never saw or heard from any of those men that fell out again. I don't know what happened, but I was determined not to fall out. And they told me a time or two, fall out, we'll let you ride on the next truck northward. And I pretended not to understand. And I kept walking, and and I finally told my men who were carrying me, the Chinese were stabbing them with bayonets because we couldn't keep up. I said, turn me loose, I'll make it. You men go ahead, because the Chinese are getting pretty angry. And so they went ahead and left me, and I was the last man in the column. And after several days, they realized I was determined to keep up. So at that point, they started assigning one guard, or sometimes 2 guards, to me. And they were always rushing me, but they allowed me to fall behind. And then I'd have to walk for another hour or 2 to catch up with the main group when they stopped at daylight. We did that for about 2.5 weeks. We approached the Yalu River, which is the river separating North Korea from China. And we were entering a small city or town named Pyeongtaek. And that Pyeongtaek was where they had determined that would be a prisoner of war camp. But as we were on an inlet, and they were figuring out, I believe, how to get us across the water into Pyeongtaek, I heard planes overhead, and this was the daytime, several U.S. Air Force B-26s were overhead, and we saw them dropping these bundles of incendiary bombs. And immediately the Chinese turned us around and then headed us in a different direction. And we went about another 7 miles up the Yalu River, and they set up camp in some Korean shacks in a valley. We did not know the name of the little tiny village, but we always just called it the valley. And that took about 2.5 weeks to reach the valley, but I was separated from all the officers, and I was really separated from all of my men, because I was put in a shack by myself with 11 other seriously wounded American soldiers. And that's the way I spent my time after we reached the camp.
Up the valley. Was that the low point, do you think, in your captivity when you first were put in that shack with the 11 others? Was there any kind of despair, or what was running through your mind at that point?
Well, yes, there was a lot of despair. Number one, we were hungry. We hadn't had anything to eat. And we expected to be taken to some type of a camp. Instead, we were just taken into abandoned mud shacks that had previously been occupied by peasant-type farmers. And these shacks were made out of mud, 2 rooms, sometimes 3 rooms. The walls were mud, the floors were mud, the roof was covered with straw, rice straw. Each room had 1 small window, and it was not glass, but paper. These little shacks always faced the south because they were taking advantage of the sun during the daytime, and the kitchen was always on the west end. And rather than the smoke going out of a flue in the kitchen, they directed the smoke underneath the floor, the mud floor, in these shacks, and it came out of a small smokestack on the east end of the shacks. And they did it this way because the prevailing winds were from west to east. And that was the only way those peasants had of warming their houses. Unfortunately, we were in shacks where they did not build any fires in the kitchen. So we did not have any heat in those mud shacks in the valley at all the first winter. And temperatures were getting down way below zero, sometimes 10, 15, 20 degrees below zero. And I was in there with the sick and wounded, and I realized that there was no water. I hadn't had a drop of water to drink after I'd been captured. It began snowing 3 or 4 days after I was captured, and I would eat snow to quench my thirst. It was 4 days after I was captured, which was November 8th, and I remember the date because that's my birthday. We got our first meal. It was 4 days after our capture, and our first meal was dried field corn, which had been soaked in water for a little bit, and the kernels were softened. And we were given a handful of that field corn, and that was our meal. So that was a big disappointment because I was expecting at least water to drink and something to eat. But even worse, we spent the entire first winter, the winter of 1950, 1951, with no heat in the shacks. We were given no blankets whatsoever to cover up, protect us from the cold. They crowded us into these rooms. The rooms about 9 feet square. They put 12 or 15 in the room. We would cling to one another just as tightly as we could. But even so, some of the men in the room with me lost fingers and lost toes due to frostbite. Then there were no toilet facilities, not even an outside latrine, absolutely nothing. And we could, we'll use the expression, go to the bathroom. The guards would let us get 10 or 12 feet from our shack, and then we would do our job, whatever it happened to be. Then we have to go back inside there, but there were no toilet facilities. And I never realized that we would be subjected to such primitive conditions and such inhumane conditions.
You said at one point in your book, you realized that you still had your pocket Bible on you after capture. What was it like the first time when you realized you had that? Can you tell me a little bit?
Well, I did not think about my pocket Bible, except immediately after I was captured. I said I'd better hide it. So I put it inside the sock of my left foot. I'd already lost the sock and the shoe on my right foot where I'd been shot in. And I was able to hang on to the Bible. I got into this room with those sick and wounded, And after we'd been there for a day or two, I thought about my Bible. I pulled it out, and I opened it up, and I read it to myself. And I read the 23rd Psalm. And the reason I read that was because my mother had told me when I was a child, when you're in trouble or extremely worried, read the 23rd Psalm. It will help your morale, help boost your spirits. So I read the 23rd Psalm a time or two to myself. I closed the Bible, and the next day I did it again. And when I finished, I said to the men, I said, I've got a pocket Bible. Would you like me to read the 23rd Psalm to you? And all of them said, yes, please, read to us. They were very eager for me to read to them from that Bible. So I read the 23rd Psalm. I closed the Bible. And they said, Lieutenant, read some more, read some more. So I opened the Bible up, and I just read from that point on several hours every day. They were eagerly listening to me as I read the Bible, but I always had to appoint one person to look through the corner of that little window, which was covered with paper, for the North Korean or Chinese guards, because I realized they were atheists and they were very anti-Christian, and the consequences were right severe if you professed any form of religion, Christianity or any other religion. So I was in there with the other seriously wounded, and it gave me pleasure to read the Bible to them, and I think it gave them a certain degree of peace to have me read.
What gave you hope during this time?
I beg your pardon?
What gave you hope during this time of captivity?
Well, from time to time, we could hear explosions, and I don't know now if it was bombing from our planes. I believe it may have been the Marine Corps battle at the Chosin Reservoir, which took place about this time. It was the sounds were 20-25 miles away, but I thought it was the U.S. Army coming to get us, to liberate us. I never realized that our military was fighting a losing war at that point. But reading the Bible, built up our morale, gave me hope. The fact that we expected to be liberated by the U.S. military at any time gave us hope. And from time to time, we would look outside to make sure we didn't see any U.S. military tanks or vehicles coming through the mountain pass. But it was not to be. But we would talk about home, and some of the men would become despondent, and those who became despondent would stop eating, and that was fatal because they usually died pretty soon. But I forced myself to believe that the war would be over about week after next. And I was always telling me about week after next, we should be getting out of here. And I just forced myself to be optimistic. And I think that's what kept me going. Now, the other thing was I ate anything that they served to us, and the food was absolutely terrible. The food at that time was just a cupful of millet seed in the morning, partially cooked, and another cupful at night. And there, the little shack I was in was at the edge of a soybean field, and sometimes I would tell to the guard I had to go outside the bathroom, and they would motion to go, and I would sit down in that snow, and I would move the snow and pick up soybean seed which had shattered out of the pods and fell to the ground. And I would eat those dried, uncooked soybean seed. There was not a lot. There was not a lot to give us hope. You just had to develop your own system of hoping.
So eventually, you were able to move to a camp-like structure. How did that change anything for you in captivity? Eventually getting out of the sick shack and moving into a camp?
Well, we arrived in the valley in these shacks the little after the middle of November, maybe near the end of November. But around the end of January 1951, they moved us back to Pyeongtaung. Now, Pyeongtaung was a city that was hit with incendiary bombs as we approached it about sometime earlier. And I expected it to be a real camp. But once again, we were in homes formerly occupied by North Korean families. The homes were somewhat better than the peasant homes in the valley, but they were still mud construction, straw roof, mud floor, paper windows, that sort of thing. Some of the rooms, some of the buildings, they would use to cook our millet seed. And the people in those rooms were very fortunate because that smoke passed underneath the floor and warmed up the floor. Other rooms they did not cook in, they were cold. But after we got to Pyeongtaung, which they called Camp 5, we had no idea where camps 1, 2, 3, 4 were. But they called Pyeongtaung Camp 5. Conditions improved somewhat because we were able to get a little bit of water after several weeks, and then we were able to get our millet seed pretty well, you can count on twice a day. It was, and the food was not good at all. Millet seed, little tiny yellow seed you buy whenever you buy feed for parakeets or canaries or wild birds. But I was a farm boy and I knew what it was, and I ate it. Some of the men would not eat it. But this was getting along now 3 or 4 months into captivity, and then the deaths really increased. We had a few deaths along and along, but after we reached the permanent camp, well, it was permanent for me until October, the deaths began, and there were 30 and 40 young American men that died of freezing and starvation in Camp 5 every day there at Pyeongtaung. It was extremely stressing. It was one of the worst things that you can possibly imagine. And I can remember one night I was in a room with 11 other men sleeping on the floor. We did not have any way to keep warm, but the next morning I shook the man on my left, and I remember that quite well because he was our company executive officer and a good friend of mine. His name was Lieutenant Richard Hagen from Van Nuys, California. I shook Lieutenant Dick Hagen, and blood gushed from his mouth. And I think he had pneumonia and he died during the night. I tried to awaken the man on the right to tell him that we'll be bringing our little cup full of millet seed pretty soon, and he did not respond, and he too was dead. And that was frightening. In a room with 12 men, one night the man on each side of you had died.
And you, all the while, had a wounded foot that had still not received any medical attention.
That is right. Now, prior to this time, Lieutenant Hagen had been hit in his other foot by rifle fire, but his wound was not serious. And so I gave him my good boot, and they might have not matched up, but he had two boots, and so I was spending the winter barefooted. But Lieutenant Hagen died, and goodness, it was a terrible feeling, but I didn't know what else to do except to unlace the boots on Lieutenant Hagen's feet, because one of them belonged to me. And I took the two boots off, and I put them on my feet, and then finally, the rest of the winter, I had a pair of boots to spend the rest of the winter.
So after this time, you made a mention, not only did you not get any medical treatment, but you too eventually had a scare with death after you realized you had gotten sick with hepatitis. Can you tell me about that?
Well, when they moved us from the valley to Camp 5, I was in this shack in the valley with enlisted men, mostly. There was one lieutenant, Oklahoma City, who died. But they put us in the shack. Now, will you please repeat that question?